Hello, my name is Jackie Green. I'm one of the nurses from Young Minds Matter. As part of my role, I also work with the School Links team, and we offer training to professionals. We offer training to parents and carers, and also deliver assemblies in schools. So one of the sessions for professionals that we do is anxiety, and that's what we're covering today. We do have a pre and post measure for this, so any feedback that you have at the beginning and also at the end will be greatly received. It would really help us to know if the session has been useful for you. Aims of the session today. So we've got kind of three key areas that we're going to cover. What we want to do is understand the term anxiety, really explore what that means. We want to identify when anxiety becomes a problem and how to help children and young people who may be experiencing anxiety as a problem. So at the end of this session, we can walk away with some practical strategies, ideas that we can use to support our children and young people. So this might be an opportunity for you guys to pause the video if you want to discuss this, either with anyone that you're watching this video with, or maybe have a pen and paper handy and jot some ideas down. The term anxiety, very common, I'm sure, a word that we're all familiar with, but we also think it means different things to different people. So it's really valuable to get everyone's opinion on what they think it is. We do understand that there are some common themes that people can experience when they're describing anxiety when it becomes a problem to them. So, I don't know what you've got now, but we've got feeling of unease, worry, fear, or even panic. And this can be experienced from situations that are real, but also situations that are imagined. Our brains are not very good at noticing when something's real or imagined, so we can still have that same feeling of unease, fear, panic that can happen, particularly if we're thinking something might go wrong, I'm not going to do very well, everything's going badly. We really can sort of catastrophize and imagine the worst. So I think that's quite an important thing to consider when we're thinking about anxiety, because the ifs and the might happens and all of those things can have just as much of an effect on how we feel, how we think and how we behave, and raise our anxiety levels. Just going to talk about key areas that are about our survival mechanisms. So we've got the fight, flight, freeze, which is maybe three areas you may be familiar with. We've also got face. I'm just going to briefly talk about each one. I think the key message for this is they're all part of a very ancient survival mechanism that we had as a response to really escape, to run away, to survive a particular threat. That goes right back to our evolutionary stage. Animals and primates and reptiles could all experience this type of response, and as humans as well. You know, we are a successful species for a reason. We've been able to adapt and survive all those different threats. And this mechanism that we have, the fight, flight, freeze and face, is very much part of that. So if we are perceived, there's a threat, we imagine that we need to escape, we need to fight back, we would literally, a response would be quite an automatic response. We to come up to that threat and physically do something about it. We will talk about that in a bit more detail and all of these key areas and how they can impact on our behaviour and what we might see when someone's caught in that fight, flight, freeze or face situation when they're faced with a particular threat. I think flight speaks for itself. The picture's quite good at indicating what's happening. Flight, we're running away from a threat. We're not going to stick around and find out if it's actually going to harm us in some way. You know, our ancient ancestors would have had threats, dangers, things that could actually kill them. So these responses very much keeping us alive. Our modern day threats may be different, of course, traffic jams, interviews, tests at school, but still, you know, we have these reactions that can create that same response in us. We've got freeze. Freeze is about literally what it says. Try and sort of almost camouflage yourself away from a particular threat, stopping still. We will talk about that in a bit more detail, but freeze, not just a physical thing, but it can literally kind of stop us from thinking. It can affect our memory. It can really just have quite an impact on how we, feel, how we think, and how we behave. Face is one where we're more or less trying to befriend. We're trying to keep an eye on the thing that's threatening us. We're trying not to be a threat. We're trying to really keep that observation and keep that peace and keep that awareness of where the threat is at all times. We're not doing anything to provoke a reaction by that perceived threat that may harm us. Well, think about maybe a situation where that might happen. I'm thinking of somebody who might be in maybe a domestic violence situation and their partner is that threat. So they're doing things very, very mindfully. It takes quite a lot of energy and focus as well to be so careful and so aware not to provoke a situation. From a child's point of view, that might well be a perceived threat. It could be a teacher, it could be another member, another peer, but always being wary and careful of the way that you're responding and interacting with the particular threat that you perceive it to be. What threats do our children and young people face? We've made a sort of common themes that we see in our referrals and the information that we receive and we discuss with our children and young people. And a lot of those, taking a look at this side, are about fears. Things that a child or young person can feel very threatened by. They're not saber-toothed tigers anymore. They are about feeling the possibility of rejection, maybe feeling the fear of failing. It could be failing in a number of different areas, in relationships, in exams, in expectations of others, not matching up, not being good enough. Fears of not meeting other people's expectations, which could come from our community, our school, our families, our peers, our siblings, all of those things that, even from the media, there's lots of things that our children and young people feel that they have to match up to. And if we feel we don't, then we can feel that we're failing. And we can feel that we might not fit in. We might not be in with our peer groups. And that fear of rejection becomes a very scary thing. Because we're group animals, aren't we? We need each other for survival. If we're rejected, if we're left out in the cold, we're isolated, we're alone, very, very scary place to be. And that can trigger the kind of responses that we spoke about earlier and certainly raise that sense of anxiety, fear, panic and worry. As I say, the fear of just not being good enough, not matching up to what you might think is expectation. And like I said before, it doesn't have to be a real threat. It can be an imagined. Our children are very good at kind of imagining things about themselves that they might think are negative, are not very nice or bad. I've certainly had lots of children and young people very much of that opinion of themselves. So it doesn't really matter if anyone's actually said, you're not good enough. If that's the kind of message that they're receiving or how they're feeling, well, there'll still be a reaction to that threat and the raised anxiety will still be experienced. This is another opportunity that you might want to pause and have a think about this. Write your ideas down or discuss them together. But what are the behavioural signs of anxiety? And also think about, alongside of this, maybe what are the physical signs as well, because we will talk about those on a different slide. So thinking about, this is thinking about the bodily signs, so we're going to sort of have a think about those physical signs and what you've got written down. But there's lots of physical things that go on for our children and young people. And sometimes they're really important in terms of understanding the impact that fight, flight, freeze or face reaction can have on us physically, but also the clues that our children and young people can give us when it might be telling us about how they feel. And if they're experiencing anxiety when it becomes a problem and these things become difficult to manage, and also they're able to maybe talk about physical reactions much more easier, maybe in more detail, much more readily than identifying and naming changes in emotions or really kind of sharing or noticing those changes in behaviour. Because there is still a stigma attached, I think, to feeling anxious, to having issues with your mental health and well-being. I know I had a conversation with a young lady who had been experiencing quite high levels of anxiety, and those threats that we talked about were very real for this young lady. But she felt very different. She felt that having anxiety meant that she was mental and there was something bad about her. So naming that emotion and describing those feelings was actually quite difficult. So when we were thinking more around how she was feeling physically, those were much more, she was much more able to tell me about that. So if there's a physical reaction going on, there will be bodily signs. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a couple of slides' time. The reactions that the body will experience, particularly if we're thinking about the fight, flight and freeze, racing heart, dry mouth, tension in the muscles, sweating, feeling dizzy, shaking, feeling sick, stomach cramps and pupil dilation, very, very common things. What we'll discuss in a minute is why these things happen, but they're actual physical reactions when we feel our anxiety levels raise. When I'm first started presenting, I would get quite nervous, but I'd noticed that my mouth was going dry or I was getting quite hot. And again, those reactions were about feeling anxious, were about kind of worried, maybe that imagined threat of not guessing it right or something happening that wasn't quite good or quite good enough. So my body was responding to that raised anxiety. And this body map, is really just to go through physically what's happening to the body when we have increased adrenaline being pumped into our system. And that happens when there is a perceived threat, when the brain responds to something happening around that person. Like I say, imagined or real. You're stuck in a traffic jam, you've got to get to a meeting or an interview or an exam, and you think you're not going to get there in time, you're going to be late, you're going to fail, everything's going to go wrong, you're catastrophizing, if I don't get this exam, I don't pass, I don't get into the next stage of my career, and it's all going to fail. So you'll instantly, there'll be probably a situation where if there's adrenaline in the system, the brain will be hijacked. You won't be able to think straight. People talk about that a lot when they're in that fight, flight, freeze, or face mode. Very kind of muddled thinking, quick thoughts, all racing around. Very difficult to think rationally in that situation. So if someone's becoming very anxious and in that fight, flight, freeze, face place, it's not the time to try and problem solve or discuss things or have a rational conversation or expect an explanation or a calm response, because you're really not in that position to do that. Because we spoke about survival. That's what the body is being primed to do. It's being primed to respond to that threat in order to survive it. So let's take fight, for example. If you want to fight something or flight, you want to run away from it, you physically need to be pumped up. Your muscles need to be primed, so there will be blood being taken from other areas of the body, like dry mouth, so there'll be narrowing of the blood vessels. The heart will be racing, will be beating much stronger, and the blood will be taken to the big muscles in the legs. Although our man doesn't have very big legs, but really kind of strong sense that you'll be able to escape that and use your strength and your speed to get out of that situation. There'll be certain things happening to the body that don't need attention. So we don't need to be digesting the lunch that we had, because that doesn't help us run faster and get away from that situation. And we hear about that from our children, young people will tell us, I feel sick, I've got funny tummy, I'm nauseous, butterflies. That is because the digestion system's actually being shut down at that point. The body knows we don't need to do that. And that affects how the food is being digested and how we feel. Our breathing, we need more oxygen. So there'll be changes in the breathing pattern that we have and that we're aware of, becoming maybe quite fast, maybe quite shallow. But that in effect can also cause dizziness. It creates a response and a change, so we might be able to tell somebody about that. It can, that lightheadedness sometimes that people describe. We don't need to be, if we want to get rid of waste, and then that can trigger the bladder response. We need to go to the toilet, we need to go for a poo, we need to do all those different things, so it can kind of have that. We might see a child or young person going backwards and forwards to the toilet just prior to something like an exam, or needing to go when there's that perceived threat. We hear quite a lot, because we do a sort of blank body map with our children, and they'll tell us that they've got maybe shaky legs or tingly legs or strange things going on in their hands and trembling, and that also can happen. Certainly changes in body temperature. The body's trying to cool its systems down. So, I mean, we've got here an explanation which I think is quite interesting, but if you think about how ancient this response is, sweating allows the body to cool down and to become more slippery to allow escape. I think that's quite incredible, but that's all about survival. And these reactions are automatic. We haven't got control over them. They're our automatic response in terms of our survival. So we don't just decide, when we're going into a fight, flight, freeze, this is what can be happening. And what the best we can do is maybe just be aware of what's happening, know why it's happening in the context of anxiety, in the context of survival. So we understand it, so we don't think we're going to have a heart attack, or we don't think we're going mad if our thoughts are racing. And that it doesn't become too scary as well, because there's plenty of ambulances and visits to the doctor and a variety of other things that have happened when people misinterpret those physical reactions to something very wrong with them, and they think they're really poorly, having a heart attack, something really dreadful's happening. So it's really good, it's really helpful to know about these reactions and where they fit in our survival response. So let's think about the behaviour. Again, it's attached to those key areas that we spoke about, the fight, flight, freeze, or face, and how they impact on what we do. How we, might be behaving purely because we want to get away from, we want to face, or we want to escape that threat. We're not just running from saber-toothed tigers anymore. It's like our caveman ancestors would be. We might be in a classroom or in a workplace or in a team meeting, or in a lesson, in an exam. But if we feel like we want to just fight that threat, then explosive tempers, things that are quite full of expression, becoming angry, wanting to control a situation. If you have control of something, you have a certain sense of predictability. It reduces that fear. It's a way of coping, and it's a way of kind of trying to really manage that threat. But because if we're seeing these changes in behaviour or seeing these challenges in that behaviour, it's not always certain that we'll be seeing it in the context of anxiety. We might well be seeing that and judging that in a way that we label as naughty. So we might misinterpret and mislabel the behaviours, and maybe that would lead us to respond in certain ways that might not be as helpful, misunderstand a particular individual who might need a different type of support or approach to help in regulating their mood and their behaviour. Thinking about flight, and again, this makes us think about children and young people we might know, we might recognise in our classrooms, in our homes, in our communities. Again, a survival mechanism, trying to get away from a particular threat or trying to cope with that, trying to manage that threat in some way, that will impact on certain behaviours. So if someone's in flight mode, they're not going to be feeling relaxed. They're going to want to just sort of keep moving around. Physically, they'll be feeling quite uncomfortable, probably. So they may be, their thoughts might be racing. They might need to be checking on everything, reassurance. They'll be over-worrying. Really difficult to relax. Because if you're primed to respond and to try and do something about it, your body is getting pumped with that adrenaline, and it's having a reaction. It's having an impact. Certainly avoiding situations because you don't want to go into the thing that's making you feel more anxious and more afraid. Thinking about freeze and what that looks like possibly. And I'm hoping by this stage you might have some ideas of some people that are coming into your mind, certain individuals or certain experiences, certain things that you've noticed. So you might see if someone's in freeze mode that they're spaced out, not really taking things in, sort of looking out of the window, not really engaging with maybe a particular activity. Sometimes, so freezing, you're much more comfortable if you're on your own, so isolating, becoming withdrawn, getting away from people, that feels safer, so that will be something that you would want to do. So hiding away. But again, if you're doing that, sometimes, that behaviour could be interpreted as just being quiet, just not being maybe even interested in what's going on. So we might not be aware that underlying that, what's driving that is that reaction, that survival reaction when we're feeling really anxious or afraid. We have a threat that we are very aware of, and this is a way of coping and managing with that threat. And finally, we mentioned face briefly before, but again, really not wanting to provoke the certain threat that's happening. If we think about that, I do apologise, we think about that in terms of our particular threat that are around us, a teacher, a member of the family, a partner, whoever that might be, a peer that might be bullying them. So people pleasers, not really saying what they really think. To say what you really think could provoke a negative reaction. That's not going to happen. Being a yes child, being over-caring, over-attentive, over-concerned about how someone's feeling. But, again, without meaning to, but maybe we will respond to that child and label that in a different way and not see it in the context of anxiety, but perceive it as being maybe clingy. My background, just for an example of this, and it often does make me think about this particular child, is in primary teaching many years ago. And, I had a busy classroom. There's one particular young boy that I do remember being exceptionally clingy. And I do remember thinking, I've got so many other things to do. I have 33 other kids in this classroom. I can't spend every 5 minutes with this child. But at that time, which was quite a while, over 20 years ago now, I didn't think about him in terms of anxiety or whether he was worried or frightened or having difficulty coping and feeling threatened. So, and I think that example kind of teaches me, even now, all this time later, how important it is to, just sometimes to shift how we perceive a child, because if we change how we see something, it will impact and change how we respond to it as well. And I think this increased understanding is really valuable for us, because I do question whether I might have responded or supported or looked at that situation with different eyes, through a different lens, if I'd have had, the beauty of this type of knowledge at that time. So what you may also notice in the classroom, and I think again this is looking at the accumulation of those examples we've used, particularly with physical reaction affecting concentration. If we think about that racing thoughts, not really in a position to think about because the focus is survival, avoiding certain situations, getting away from a particular threat. We know that if the body is frequently, having injections of adrenaline, which is the reaction that will happen before in fight, flight, freeze or phase, that's very tiring for the body. The body takes time to get over that. It's quite toxic for the system. So tiredness, particularly when we're really tense, and it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of energy to focus on getting away from a particular threat, all impact on how you feel. So there will be some tiredness, irritability, and headaches. Changes in eating pattern, we certainly see that, eating too much or too little. We've spoken about those changes in behaviour and the challenges that behaviour can present to us. I think importantly, as professionals, and certainly with a position where you might know a child or young person, you may well notice some of those changes in that challenging behaviour or changes in the way they present generally. And those are really important kind of clues as well, and often the sorts of things that we're looking at if we want to intervene early, or just be curious and trying to understand what might be driving some of those changes. Having regular kind of bouts of worry and increased anxiety and a fight, flight, freeze, and the impact that can have physically on the body, it can start to impact on the immune system as well. We have various chemicals being injected that are quite toxic for the system. And if you have reduced immunity, you might have increased illness, you might have increased absences from school. All of those things may indicate that there is something emotional going on, not just physical, particularly if that's out of character or unusual for that individual as well. And we know that these things can affect mood over time. So we're going to think about what could be the long-term effects of anxiety, the more we've understood about the physical and the emotional and how they interact and how that can have an impact, and not just on us emotionally, but also, lowering the immune system. The body only has so many resources, and if it's being filled with sort of toxic chemicals over time, certainly there potentially can be an impact and a recurring illness. And again, that can potentially with increased isolation. And people, if they're trying to cope with these difficult emotions, don't always seek the best way. We're always after short-term, quick interventions, but those coping strategies, sometimes when we say unhelpful, it's because they really don't change or tackle the cause of the anxiety or how best to manage that. So some of those coping strategies, if it's avoidance, that may increase the isolation because we might not be engaging with this sort of level of connection and interaction and social engagements that we probably want to do if they're anxiety provoking. So it just has a kind of negative knock-on effect. If we're struggling to manage ourselves and how we feel and coping, holding down demanding jobs or managing ourselves with new challenges might be difficult. So, there can be, in certain circumstances, a challenge and a struggle to hold down jobs because life is full of new challenges, isn't it? There will be things that will provoke and raise our anxieties. There will be things that might be perceived as a threat. If we haven't really developed helpful coping strategies, again, it's not going to help us cope with demands in other areas of our lives. So again, these can become more challenging to be successful in. And if you're feeling quite anxious, it's going to be fairly difficult to enjoy life. So ongoing, prolonged anxiety can make that very difficult to enjoy. And significant and long-term mental health problems, because anxiety issues can become quite chronic and they can lead into adulthood. And we know from research, and that's why we're very interested in developing our early intervention and our skills in noticing things as soon as possible. So if a child is developing a mental health and emotional well-being issues, quite soon, maybe even before the end of secondary school, if these things are not addressed and the unhelpful coping strategies persist, then we might be looking at somebody who could develop issues into adulthood. There's a video in terms of when is anxiety a problem. I'm not going to play it now on our teaching video, but please have a look. It just kind of covers really some of those main topics that we have thought about, and kind of in a short 5-minute video really explains the function of anxiety, the function of the fight and flight and what's happening, and it helps us to normalise and explain it, and also to really recognise maybe some of those behaviours. It's a great additional teaching aid as well if you were going to share it together as a team or share it with any of your children and young people. It may help just to reinforce or explain the types of things that we've covered so far. So just thinking about from a CBT, a cognitive behavioural therapy, which is something that we use at Young Minds Matter, to really explore in CBT terms what's called often the vicious circle, but it is the relationship, the things that happen between our thoughts, our feelings and our behaviours, and how they're interconnected and affect ultimately how we feel. And how when a perceived threat is acknowledged, is responded to, we think about our fight, flight, freeze and face, the impact that will have and can have on our thoughts. And then we'll kind of think about how we can intervene in each of those areas to support positive change. So just to focus for the time being on thoughts. Often if we're feeling anxious, there will be negative thoughts. Often, people who are really struggling with that emotion, they'll probably have thoughts that something bad will happen, or they just won't be able to cope with it because it feels either too overwhelming or too scary, or they don't feel good enough. Something about that situation, that thought will be really strong, quite persistent and quite intrusive, and may happen quite quickly and again. So we want to identify that and be aware of that so we can start to do something about it and challenge them. So how to help with anxious thoughts? And you may well have children and young people talk to you about them, share them, are aware of them, but are not quite sure what to do. So I think first of all, because we know how the relationship that we have with our children and young people is so valuable, and the building of a trusting conversation, and about allowing that young person to really tell them this story to you, and allowing them to talk when they feel anxious and share that feeling. You know, those conversations are really supportive for our children and young people, because there is still a stigma, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to trust straight away that they can actually talk about worries or talk about changes in their thoughts, feelings and behaviours. So that type of conversation, as obvious as it sounds, has a real foundation to really hone in on what is most challenging about that feeling of anxiety and what it is, and supporting to normalise that. And again, we're just moving on to that normalising the experience that may mean a child or young person can feel anxious. And already we can really start to talk about the physical reactions, the behavioural changes, the changes in thoughts and feelings. All those things are quite normal if you're feeling worried about something. Even understanding a fight, flight, freeze, face response, knowing it's a survival mechanism, knowing it has a purpose, something about trying to help you survive that in itself can be really helpful. Just because an understanding really kind of reduces that stigma and that sense of being different or strange, and really gives a sense of hope, I think, as well, about, you know, we can do something about reducing that and supporting some positive change. So we can use distraction techniques, and distraction is really having a positive focus on something and not focusing on your negative thoughts. Kind of think about, if you focus on something negative, particularly, you know, thoughts that will happen again and build up, it's like a magnifying glass. It's like happens more and more and gets more and more difficult. But when you take that focus away and you really absorb yourself in something positive, something that gives you a sense of enjoyment or purpose or value, it can be very individual. So again, it's a really good idea to have a conversation with a child or young person about what they find positive in terms of their own distraction and what they do, because they may do things already. Lots of young people have fabulous ideas, much better than the things I probably can think about. They find, you know, they're listening to music, the arts and crafts they do, the things that they're watching on TV and on YouTube, etc., will be really helpful. So you can really kind of weave that into a plan when you're thinking about distraction, but it is just a positive focus. So we might want to use, this is a kind of example of a structured conversation that you might have with a child or young person to sort of support them in challenging unhelpful thoughts. And we mean unhelpful because it keeps them in a state of anxiety quite often. It stops them from moving forward. It kind of, we call it that vicious circle for a reason, because the negative thoughts, that's the bit, you know, we've got that key bit there that's holding that vicious circle in place. So if we can change that element of we can break that link, that part of that chain, that again starts to support positive change, starts to really help a young person or child to recognise that things can be different. And when we feel and support a positive change in their mood and reducing that anxiety. So they may be able to name what negative thoughts that they're having. And that could be a variety of different things. Often, you know, the key themes could be around relationships, friends. And we thought about those key threats earlier around maybe not feeling good enough, feeling fear of failure, feeling of rejection. All of those bits could go in at that beginning bit of this balancing the negative thought exercise. But then we look for the evidence together around what is it that keeps that thought going. And that child or young person and yourself would really discuss that in some detail. But then we want to be looking at, to break that chain, what's the evidence against that? And if it's a fear of failing, for example, and then you've sort of looked at the evidence for, and there might have been a test last week where they didn't do so well, but there might be some evidence of the week before and several months before and years where they've done really well, and it was just an off day, and it doesn't mean that they're going to fail in the future. So you can start to build some of those bits of evidence, really factual evidence, and I think that's important. Think about the facts, you know, keep it factual as well. And that, again, we're trying to build a bit of a balance. We're not just focusing on all the negatives. Let's bring in some of those factual, evidential things that we can really say, actually, no, this happened, so this isn't necessarily something that's going to be the same again and again. We want to reduce that anxiety. So is the negative thought valid? Ultimately, is that negative thought valid? Is it factual? Is it valid? Probably not. You've probably built enough evidence to really inform that young person or child and really see it in black and white and write things down that's very powerful, to really kind of go, hang on a minute, brakes on, no, probably not valid, probably not just the truth that we think it is. And from there we can decide, or you can decide with the child what would be a more balanced, fair kind of thought, really. That yes, maybe I had a difficult an exam, but I know that I can do well in other exams, and with revision I can sort of improve my grades gradually. And you can just, you can choose any example really, but you can together have a bit more of a fair and compassionate, balanced thought. And then you sort of practice that bit. You focus on that one. So thinking about feelings, as we know, our physical reactions are very intertwined with the response that we have when a threat appears, whatever that might be, imagined or real. And we have all those physical reactions. Adrenaline is being pumped around the system. So we've got tension in the muscles, we're feeling shaky and lightheaded, our heart rate's going really faster. All of those things preparing us, physical body wanting to fight, flight, freeze or face, it's very key. So how do we intervene? How do we help calm that system down? Because if we calm physically how we feel, our emotions will follow suit. And we'll start to feel calmer, not just physically, but also reducing that anxiety. So again, have a conversation and think about normalising those physical symptoms in relation to what the body's trying to do in response to survival. And that's very different context to, my goodness, I'm really ill or I'm going mad, or all those negative responses that you can have, and increase that fear, because that can be quite scary and a threat in itself. Look at those positive, interventions. Exercises have evidenced for many different emotional difficulties, really positive impact on regulating mood and helping us feel better, helping us physically calm down, helping get rid of that. There's a feeling of being hyped up, getting rid of that energy. And when we've done that, often our systems will feel a lot more calm. We may then be in a place where we can talk about our feelings and the things that are more difficult to process and to access. So having access to activity and exercise, and they don't have to be an hour long. Sometimes just 10 minutes of physical activity can be enough of time, enough of a distraction, enough of an intervention to soothe and calm that system down, really get rid of some of that adrenaline. And we don't want to lose sight of the importance of sleep and diet. Sleep hygiene, a good sleep pattern, having good sleep routines, really important. We know it doesn't matter really other interventions that you do, but if you haven't slept well, then our ability to cope and manage and problem solve and think straight and all those different things, very difficult. So, sleep and diet, we don't want to you want to be aware maybe of what a child young person is having, because some of the foods and the drinks that we can have can mimic the impact, the same symptoms. If you think about the physical symptoms, the, heart palpitations or, kind of rush of energy that sugars and caffeine can really pump into our systems. They can, sometimes if we change our diet, it actually reduces those symptoms, and then that reduces the feeling of being anxious. For example, I had a young lady who just drank far too much caffeine, and her body was reacting to that caffeine, which was making her feel anxious. So when we reduce the caffeine in her drinks, she started to feel much calmer and much more settled and much less anxious. So, she certainly didn't need a referral to Young Minds Matter for CBT. She just needed to change her diet. So again, it's really important, it's really good to explore these things. So we were thinking about calming our system down physically. We use in Young Minds Matter a whole range of different breathing techniques with our younger and older children. And we know breathing in a very deep, mindful, calm way very regular way can be the key thing to kind of fool our brain into really thinking, knowing the threat isn't real. It's okay. You can calm that system down really effectively. There's an example of 5-star breathing, which is something we'd do in an assembly. There's another YouTube link for another breathing exercise. But there are loads, absolutely loads. There's some references at the end of this teaching session. But you can just have a Google search or YouTube the breathing exercises, and there will be quite a lot. Different people will find different things helpful. But certainly just being aware of our breathing in itself offers the opportunity to slow things down and calm our reaction, particularly when we're trying to calm our sort of automatic reaction, that fight, flight, freeze or face. We really want to regulate and feel in a place where we can just talk things through, understand it, and work on some of these other strategies that help us to manage. So all we're doing is managing anxiety and help us to cope with that. This anxiety, as we know, serves a bit of a purpose. It's there to keep us safe. We need that. It's motivating, it drives us, it helps us to stay alert, it helps us to revise if we've got an exam, it helps us motivate. We are just thinking about when it becomes a problem and it becomes debilitating, and then we can't function to our optimum. Guided relaxation is another relaxation technique, obviously. It just gives you a focus on something. We use kind of safe places, a place where you can, again, just feel calmer, feel better, feel more positive, feel safer. A place where you really can use this technique to take you visually in your mind to a place that's maybe beautiful, gives you a sense of enjoyment even. And again, children and young people will have their own ideas around what that looks like. And there's lots and lots of different guided relaxation scripts out there, videos, things, and just trying a few may help find the ones that work best for the person, individual that you're working with. So how to help feelings and intervene? I'm just kind of, we're thinking about resilience, and this toolkit just offers a bit of a structured conversation or elements of a structured conversation that you might want to really use if you're trying to sort of work with a child or young person and find out a little bit more maybe about them and help them to look, to the future and to think about things in a slightly more positive way. Particularly if you're challenging those negative thoughts maybe, you might want to support them in what will help them to remain positive and remain them to imagine what they would like from life and from their future, the things that they're good at, the goals that they can have. Because goals kind of give that real positive focus, maybe that sense of achievement. Again, really helpful, really helpful promoting emotional well-being. So establishing realistic and achievable goals, that's a step in the right direction to really self-managing and being able to use that simply as another tool to use to help you feel better. I'm not going to go through them all for this video, but I think when you look through the slides, you can really just pick out some of those things that might be of resonance to the person that you're working with, or ideas that you'd like to discuss maybe further with your team, or just think about for yourself as well. But if I particularly find, just prompts sometimes just helpful, because, you're bound to be having a conversation during maybe a busy day when there's lots of other things going on. So where those things can be really good at just prompting you, giving you some ideas that are really good in terms of helping that young person focus on something much more positive and constructive when we're trying to break that vicious circle, improve those thoughts, feelings and behaviours. So, thinking about behaviours, if you're trying to escape a difficult feeling, it makes sense sometimes to avoid and not do the things maybe you'd normally do, or get out of that situation to help you cope. But that only helps you cope in that moment. And it says there that we often call those safety behaviours, because we know that a feeling of anxiety, that change will come back. There will be further threats, or a repeat of the same one. So what we want is longer term change, a real sense that we can manage and cope with the uncomfortable feelings, and we can avoid doing those safety behaviours and limit them altogether, hopefully. So the way that we do that is by facing our fears. We call it sort of graded exposure. So we don't want to do that and it becomes terrifying and overwhelming, but we do want to sort of support and promote change over time gradually. So we learn to feel safer, we learn to feel more confident, we learn to manage those changes in our thoughts, feelings and behaviours in a much more positive way. So we want to help that child to learn from experiences that they're anxious about, that they're going to be able to cope within that, and it doesn't mean it's going to overwhelm them and their imagined fears will come true. So we do need to sit through the anxiety-provoking situation, and if we can do it with the young person at the beginning, that's fine, absolutely. If they can set some sort of graded goals, maybe 1 to 10 sometimes we use, or 1 to 5, whatever, but start with that achievable, realistic goal to begin with. For example, a young child might really find going into the playground really terrifying. So what we need to do, maybe set a goal at the beginning where you just stand together for 5 minutes outside in the playground. But for that 5 minutes, what we'll probably notice is those feeling of anxiety will be raised, it will be uncomfortable, but what we don't want to do is go back into that avoidance and go back inside and avoid going into the playground. For that 5 minutes, we'll sit and we'll kind of recognise that it will get to a peak, but there will be a point when that anxiety will start to come down. Particularly if we think about incorporating maybe some breathing exercises, visualisation, positive self-talk, using a conversation, so you can be really, that kind of understanding of what's happening. So if we find our physical getting nervous and tense and our heart racing and starting to breathe in a really quick way, or starting to have those negative thoughts, we know we can normalise that, we can explain that because we think this is going to be scary. But over time, when that starts to come back down, that's when we're starting to learn that situation is something we can cope with, and we can use those skills and those strategies. So when you go on to stage 2, only moving on to stage 2 when over time that anxiety has absolutely come back down. Sometimes we scale it or rate it. We might rate anxiety levels between 0 and 10, 0 being I don't feel anxious at all, and 10 being I really can't cope. You might find that at the beginning, it could be an 8, a 9, it could be a 10. But as we sit through that 5 minutes, that will start to drop, and it might be saying, it's now a 7, or it's a 6, or it's a 5. And over that few minutes, sitting with it, breathing, it'll start to drop. It takes time, but these are the sorts of behavioural interventions that we use where we can expose ourselves to that fear in a managed way, but with practice, we can change the habit, we can change that response. So again, really kind of useful strategy to adopt if we're looking for changes in behaviour. So we can engage fully in activities that we might be missing out on. We want our children to feel confident and feel able to enjoy those things, going into town on the bus, playing with friends in the playground, going out to parties, going into an exam hall, doing the work there. And this is the approach that might help with that. So, just an example, again, you could pause the video, have a think about that together. But it's an opportunity to practice some of the activities that we've spoken about. So we have our young lady called Sally, and she doesn't like going into assembly. She's worried everyone will laugh at her, and Sally never goes to assembly. So you guys can put together your plan, think about what interventions might support Sally in reducing that anxiety and feeling able to cope, building her confidence and that resilience. If you have any questions, I know as a School Links team we'll be happy to receive them and do our best to answer some of those if that will be of any help to you as well. So we're nearly finished. Just thinking about, support for yourselves, individually or as a team. There's education material on Minded for teaching staff. You may have some peer mentors in your workplace or Senko, pastoral support. Kooth is an online counselling service for children over 11. We've got our School Links team and the duty line at Young Minds Matter. So thank you for watching. Please fill out your post measure. Your feedback obviously is really helpful. And it's been great. Thank you.